Welcome to Nuked Radio. This is episode 88. Today is Thursday, January the 24th, 2013. I'm your host, Christina Consolo, and with me today is Jules, although she'll be in the background as this is the last day before her vacation starts. This version will be slightly edited from the show that was live on Thursday. But first, I decided to throw this in with the upload. This is one of my all-time, hands-down favorite videos about Fukushima and nuclear energy from the Vlogbrothers on YouTube. Enjoy.
Good morning, John. Suddenly, along with the disaster in Japan, has become kind of necessary to understand a little bit about how nuclear reactors work. And so I hope that you will excuse me postponing my thoughts from Haiti and instead giving an introduction to how nuclear reactors work and how that pertains to the situation in Fukushima right now. So first things first, you are welcome to say nuclear, but you should know that there will always be a certain percentage of the population who will assume that you are a dumbass. I personally have no problem with nuclear, but if you want fewer people to think you're an idiot, probably should just switch over to nuclear. Now for terminology. 1. Nuclear. Pertaining to the nucleus, which is the center of the atom that contains the protons and the neutrons. Nuclear reaction, a reaction that changes the nucleus. This happens either by an atom splitting apart or by two atoms fusing together. Radiation is any particle or wave that goes through the air or goes through other things besides the air, like your body. But generally, when we're talking about nuclear radiation, we're talking about ionizing radiation, which is the kind of radiation that has enough energy to ionize an atom. Radiation can be harmless, but it can also be not harmless. Radioactive decay, this is important, it will come up again soon, is when an unstable atom loses energy by emitting radiation. Fission, when an atom breaks apart into two or more atoms that are an entirely different kind of atom than the original atom. During fission, a great deal of radiation and energy is expelled, and the fission products, which are whatever's left over, are always lighter than the original atom. Now, where did that mass go? It was converted into energy in a way that is described by a very famous equation. Notice in that very famous equation that we are multiplying by the speed of light squared. You may have noticed the speed of light. Very big number. And so when you convert a tiny amount of mass into energy, you get a great deal of energy, which is why, something in my ear, a pound of uranium-235 can be converted into as much energy as about 1 million gallons of gasoline. Speaking of which, uranium-235 is a rare isotope of uranium that has very unique properties. First very unique property, when you hit it with a neutron, doesn't even have to be a special neutron, it fissions. Second, when uranium-235 splits, it creates more neutrons, which then go on to hit more atoms of uranium-235, which then go on to create more neutrons, which then goes on to create a chain reaction that can be turned into either a nuclear bomb or a nuclear energy reactor. So in a nuclear power plant, you have uranium-235, and you have it mixed into these ceramic pellets. And through the majesty of science, these little guys can never explode like a nuclear bomb. These pellets are placed into tubes of zirconium alloy that is extremely strong and heat resistant. That tube with uranium pellets in it is what we call a fuel rod. When a bunch of these rods are placed together, the uranium begins to fission, creating energy and radiation and neutrons and fission products, which are the stuff that's left over after the uranium splits apart. All of this stuff is what is called the reactor, and it's encased inside a thick steel box, like 8 inches thick steel. That steel box is called your primary containment, and then that is inside of a giant concrete and steel box, which is your secondary containment. So in the reactor, the fuel rods are hot, water is pumped through the fuel rods, it turns into steam, the steam drives the turbine creates electricity, and that is how we get electricity from nuclear power. Now, if we want to turn it off, we have what are called control rods. Control rods absorb neutrons. You stick them in between the fuel rods, and it absorbs all the neutrons. No neutrons are left to continue the chain reaction, and the reaction stops. Ideally, that would be where it ends, but it's not, because we have those fission products. All those fission products left over from the uranium splitting are unstable isotopes, and this is where we come back to radioactive decay. Because they are unstable isotopes, they decay, and as they decay, they produce radiation and energy, and that energy becomes heat. And it's not nearly as much heat you get in the center of a reactor when it's running, but it is still a lot of heat. In fact, it is so much heat that if you don't cool it down, the fuel rods themselves will eventually break, and you will have what we call a meltdown. And this is what happened in Fukushima. As soon as the earthquake happened, the control rod slammed into place, the reaction stopped, but we still had the fission products creating a lot of heat. The grid power immediately got taken down by the earthquake, and the backup diesel generators, they got wiped out by the tsunami. And so there was nothing left to power the coolant system, the system that keeps water running through the reactor so that the fuel rods don't get too hot, they don't break, and they don't melt down. So it appears that some of the fuel rods did break. That created an environment combined with the heat that could actually split water into hydrogen and oxygen, creating hydrogen, which we all know is explosive. And we've seen the effects of that in a series of hydrogen explosions throughout the plant that have damaged both the primary and the secondary containment at least one of the reactors. Additionally, just like the reactor when it's turned off still produces heat, we have what are called spent fuel rods. These are fuel rods that no longer contain any uranium, but they do contain all of those radioactive fission products. Spent fuel rods can spend years at the bottom of giant pools while we wait for the radioactive materials in them to decay enough that they are not producing so much heat that they cannot be dealt with in a different way. And the same way that the cooling system for the reactor isn't working, the cooling system for those spent fuel rod pools is also not working. There's another difference between the reactor rods and the spent fuel rods, and that is that the spent fuel rods do not have a primary containment vessel, so there is less protection, and if the water in those pools boils off, the spent fuel rods could melt down, create a fire that would spew radioactive dust into the air, and it would be bad. The men and women who remain at the site trying to keep the situation under control are very literally risking and possibly sacrificing their lives for their country. Those men and women are made of some tough stuff, and I wish them a great deal of luck in getting this under control. You'll notice that throughout this video I have not been making judgments about whether or not we should be using nuclear power. That's because I simply do not know. I can see and understand both sides of this argument very well. I do not know whether or not the benefits of nuclear power outweigh the risks. I do know that most of the ways that we generate the majority of our power now are dangerous and bad, but that we need electricity for our society to function and for people to be happy and healthy and safe. Quite frankly, I think it's kind of ridiculous that so many people seem to have made up their minds about this issue when, obviously, it's a very complicated one. It's almost as if our society values opinions more than it values knowledge. I can only hope that this situation simply doesn't get any more severe than it already is, and that the people working at their plant and the people living nearby are able to safely return to their homes in a relatively short amount of time. And I hope that people who watch this video can understand a little bit better the situation and not panic unduly. John, I will see you on Friday.
I mean, we've got a couple of important issues that we need to get to today, and I've been getting a few emails about this. North Korea completes preparations for a nuclear test. They have completed all technical preparations and plan to carry it out in the next few days. A South Korean intelligence source said on Wednesday, North Korea had dug up a tunnel for a test at its Punagiri nuclear test site, but the tunnel has now been plugged with dirt and concrete, the source said, suggesting that all measuring and other equipment has already been installed inside. It was unclear when the tunnel was sealed. And North Korea has also reported that they're going to be testing another long-range missile. And a lot of people are grouping the nuke test and the long-range missile test together, insinuating that it's actually a nuclear warhead on this missile. That's not my understanding. The nuke test is hopefully being done underground in this tunnel that they just sealed. The long-range rocket launch is something different, but I mean, who really knows? It's coming from North Korea. So look forward to that happening probably in the next few days. Now, Alicia Heilig was scheduled to be our guest today, but she has a sick little boy that needs to go to the doctor, and she can't make it. So we hope that he feels better soon. And we're still going to talk about the salt domes today. In fact, I have a wonderful article from Germany that details the fight between politicians and activists to store radioactive waste in their salt domes, which are very similar to the ones in Louisiana and in Texas. Also, we will have the phone lines open to anyone from Bayou Corne who wants to call in and talk about this issue. I would love to hear from someone who attended the police jury meeting last night. But because I am running the board and I'm not used to answering the phone, if I disconnect you, sorry. Just call back and we'll figure it out. But first, a couple items of news about Fukushima. and about some interesting radar signatures that showed up here. We actually have 46 days till the 2-year anniversary, and we will debut my 2-year anniversary video at the end of the show today. I'll drop the link into chat. It's called Bombs Away, and I hope to do several more. A couple of headlines from Any News. Ashi is reporting that new 311 footage shows a disaster loomed at Fukushima reactor number 5. Confusion spread, tempers flared, and disaster loomed at 2 reactors of the Fukushima number 1 nuclear plant nearly 2 weeks after the crisis started in March of 2011. Footage of the plant operators' teleconferences showed at 8:58 p.m. on March 23rd. Another serious problem was revealed when a report said the temperature could rise again in the number 5 reactor. The temperature had fallen below 100 degrees 3 days earlier, so I'm not sure how high it was before that. The cooling system for number 5 stopped working, and the person who was the chief at the time, Masayo Yoshida, was furious because he did not receive the report immediately. He said, "This is a very, very important issue. If there is something abnormal, tell us without delay." And they were able to fix that pump in time. At least that's what they said. We really don't know what's going on. We never see 5 or 6, really. Any News is also reporting that radiation levels nearly doubled in Fukushima soil sample over a 5-month period. And those numbers are big. December of 2011, there was 8,790 becquerels per kilogram of cesium-134 and 137. When soil was measured again, and now this is being measured 100 kilometers west of the Fukushima Daiichi plant, April 2012, 17,000 becquerels per kilogram of cesium-134 and 137 were measured. And that's in the other direction from where the wind was blowing. Also, we had talked about this a little bit when we talked about spent fuel pool 4 and removing the rods. Yumuri reported nuclear reaction can be triggered when removing melted fuel from Fukushima plant, and you guys probably remember the video where they removed 2 rods a couple of months ago. We were all under the impression, or the impression was given that they were going to start removal of the rods at that time, but they removed 2 and then they stopped and said that that was just a test. The 2 rods that came out looked fine, and there was a number of fires that occurred in this pool. So some of those fuel rods are going to be damaged, and that's what we're talking about here. The decommissioning project will require the fuel in question to be carefully and slowly removed using special equipment in an effort to avoid a leak of nuclear fuel, while also preventing the fuel from triggering a nuclear reaction. This will be close to an unprecedented undertaking, which is hopefully why they're taking their time with it, to make sure that it's done right. And of course they're not going to start that process till they finish building the monkey bars over reactor 4 that we talked about last week. Now, something closer to home that showed up, Washington Post reported a nuclear plant produced up to 1 inch of snow in Pennsylvania. I've never seen this particular phenomenon before. That was from the author. In fact, the original article that ran, let's see here, showed a picture of this radar from Beaver Valley, and you can see this long stream of blue snow coming out of the reactor site. And the weird thing about that is, the day before, someone had posted a NOAA screen capture from Tuesday evening that was from northern Illinois. I dropped a link into chat right at the top of the hour of this picture of the radar from Illinois, showing 3 distinct snow bands that were not lake effect. They look like lake effect, but they're far away from Lake Michigan. But NOAA indicated these were coming from the cooling towers at nuke plants. So yesterday, Any News posted this Washington Post article showing the same radar signature was picked up around the same time at the Beaver Valley plant. So now this is 4 plants in 2 states that are doing the exact same thing on radar. I haven't seen this before, and neither had the author of this article, the Washington Post. And I'm kind of at a loss for an explanation about what in particular caused this to happen on multiple radars in multiple states around the same time, and why it's not present all winter. So I emailed Mike Betts from the Weather Channel about it, and I sent him these pictures, and he wrote me back and said, because it's cold. Not that uncommon in really cold air. So I want to thank Mike Betts for his astute meteorological explanation, but I still want to know why. What is the temperature difference? Well, somebody under this Washington Post article actually put in a link to a September of 1976 article in a science journal. This was a paper that was written, Snowfall Observations from Natural Draft Cooling Tower Plumes. During the winter of 1975 and 1976, snowfall from the plumes of large natural draft cooling towers of power plants has been observed. Snow accumulations up to 2.5 centimeters have been found on the ground at extended distances from the cooling towers, and visibility has been restricted to less than 1,600 meters in the tower plume near ground level. So this has been observed before, and I don't know, the author of the article in the Washington Post probably should have dug in a little bit more before he threw, statements out there that it had never been seen or experienced. It actually has been as far back as 1976. I did write Mike Betts back and asked him for a little bit more detailed of an answer. So I'll drop that article into chat for you guys. Let's see here. On to the sinkhole. This morning, there's been some very active seismic graphs showing up, and in fact the top thread on GLP is what is going on at the sinkhole. There were actually a number of locals that weighed in and said that in the area they can't really tell that anything is going on. It seems just like a normal day, uneventful day. So they're not experiencing anything as far as shaking goes or anything like that. And then Alicia, before she took off for her doctor appointment with her little boy, I had sent a link of the seismograph to her also, and she indicated they're starting to work on a road, a separate road to go to the site. So it could be from equipment that's causing a lot of, ground frequencies. And I dropped that into chat before the show too, if you want to check out that seismogram. It's much more drastic compared to even the ones that happened over the weekend when it seemed to be undergoing a growth event. And we have a couple articles about that. WWL has been following this in the area besides the Assumption Parish Police Jury. In fact, there was a meeting last night. I hope to get somebody to call in who was there to tell us what happened. Now, this was reported January 21st. Concern about an 8.5-acre sinkhole is ramping up after it burped up over the weekend. Officials in Assumption Parish removed some of the heavy equipment around the site after what's been described as a lot of seismic activity. When the sinkhole burped, it sent crude oil and debris into the air. The director of the Assumption Parish Homeland Security said instead of more drilling and cleanup, they're going to do more scientific testing to gather a risk assessment, so to speak, to find out what potentially could happen there. John Boudreau said there is concern about the sinkhole expanding. It's showing signs that it may not be finished growing, and it may grow an additional amount. Scientists say a failed underground salt cavern is to blame for the sinkhole, and they don't want it to grow to a point where it could swallow homes and businesses, especially since so many people are still living in the area. Now, in comparing what most of the people who listen to this show are here for, Fukushima, as bad as Fukushima is, it's not right in our backyard. Where the people in Bayou Corne, however, are dealing with an unusual, unprecedented geological occurrence that's just a mile or so where a whole community exists. And this community has already been divided. Approximately 300 people have been evacuated so far. But for those who remain there, every day is faced with uncertainty, and every day is faced with the unknown. When something bad happens at Fukushima, even if you live on the West Coast, we have a few days notice before the air from there is over us. But when something happens at the sinkhole, the effects are felt almost immediately for the Bayou Corne community. Now, we actually knew quite a bit about salt domes as far back as 100 years ago. In fact, I'm going to read from an article that was published in 1918 that I thought was really interesting. This appeared in the American Mineralologist. Volume 3, 1918, Minerals of the Saline Domes of the Texas-Louisiana Coastal Plain, written by Alfred Hawkins. The greater number of our most interesting mineral occurrences would remain unknown to us were it not for their close connection with ore deposits or other materials of economic importance. Even the oil fields in the topographically almost featureless plain bordering the Gulf of Mexico are found to be by no means wholly lacking in things of interest to the mineralogist. Years ago, the drilling of deep wells near the Texas-Louisiana coast at places where there were gas seeps, sulfurous springs, or salt licks led to the discovery of petroleum in that region. The gradual extension of these oil fields and the discovery of others has greatly broadened our knowledge concerning the geology and mineralology of the rocks associated with them. It has been found that the oil deposits seem to be invariably associated in this coastal plain region with what are known as saline domes. The saline domes are usually wholly subterranean and buried from sight under the nearly horizontal bedded sands and clays of the plain. Rarely are they marked by low mounds, whose summits are in some cases 60 or 80 feet above the surrounding country and have a diameter of a mile or more. At other times, their location is marked by a depression filled by a lake. Usually they are invisible to the eye, and some of them are beneath the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Some 63 such domes have been mapped to date in Texas and Louisiana alone, and others yet undiscovered doubtless exist there. Further south, in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, other similar domes are also yielding large quantities of oil. Saline domes are well known in other parts of the world. Their general characteristic is the presence within them of large deposits of mineral salts of various kinds, principally sulfates and chlorides of sodium and potassium. The domes of Germany have supplied vast quantities of potassium salts as well as of sodium salts, particularly halite. The deposits in the Texas-Louisiana region do not contain potassium salts, but are made up primarily of halite containing impurities in the form of other minerals in very minor amounts. The bottom of the salt deposits in Texas and Louisiana has never been found, though borings have pierced rock salts for a depth of 5,000 feet. The total thickness of the salt may be several times that figure. The upper part of the salt core is often conical and is usually mixed with layers of or masses of gypsum and anhydrate, known to the driller simply as gypsum and sometimes as salt. Above this, usually not many hundreds of feet below ground, there is often a so-called caprock layer of hard but porous limestone or dolomite. In the numerous cavities of the latter rock, large quantities of native sulfur are sometimes present, and petroleum is found in it or among it, the upturned sedimentary strata along the sides of the salt core. The gypsum found in the Gulf Coast saline domes appears to be usually a very interesting combination of calcium sulfate in its anhydrous forms. Abundant microscopic crystals without definite orientation or arrangement are enclosed in a matrix of gypsum, whose crystals have cleavage directions in parallel position throughout the specimen. The principal cleavage has, in some cases at least, been observed in a vertical position, indicating forces of crystallization operating in that direction. Great numbers of small anhydrate crystals also occur embedded in the rock salt. They can be freed from the matrix of salt by treating the material with water, and in the former case or with a weak solution of hydrochloric acid in the latter. In either case, the crystals will be slightly etched and roughened by this treatment, and some of their edges and corners will be rounded. There are also some very clean-cut dolomite rhododendrons. The sulfur that's present is often well crystallized, as most of the crystals are small, Sulfides in crystallized form have been reported from the salt mines of Louisiana. These are galenite, sphalerite, and pyrite. Some microscopic black crystals from the rock salt at Hockley, Texas have been determined for the writer by Dr. Edgar Wary as pseudomorphs of limonite after pyrite, the following forms having been identified. The surface clays above some of the salt domes, as in Damon Mound, are filled locally with tiny gypsum crystals and plates. There are also developments of sulfides of iron, which in water solution has been extensively sold for medicinal purposes. In the borings from within the domes, pseudomorphs of calcite after selenite crystals have been reported, as well as some others which are twinned. Most of the gypsum from the borings has a dark smoky color, and upon breaking emits a strong fetid odor. The rock salt is extensively mined in Louisiana at Weeks Island and elsewhere by means of large underground chambers. Most of the salt of the familiar granulite crystalline sort is, but with little impurity. Specimens of old borings consistent with gypsum are available at some places, Damon Mound, Texas being one of them. Under the present war conditions, it is often difficult to obtain access to the sulfur properties or the mines. So yeah, this article was written during World War I, and I will drop this into chat for you guys too. I think it's pretty amazing that they knew that much about it that long ago. I mean, even though what's happening in Bayou Corne is unprecedented, these salt domes have also been a very big point of contention and much debate in other countries as well. And this article had mentioned Germany. In fact, Spiegel had run an article from January of 2010 about a salt dome called Gorleben. And it's a salt dome which was a proposed deep geological repository for low, medium, and high-level radioactive waste. The Curse of Gorleben, Germany's endless search for a nuclear waste dump. Germany has been looking for a permanent storage site for its nuclear waste for over 30 years. The history of the Gorleben Salt Dome, a potential nuclear repository, is one full of deception and political maneuvering. And if opponents to the plans have their way, the search might even have to start again from scratch. The ride down into the Gorleben Salt Dome takes less than 2 minutes. When the elevator stops at 2,755 feet below ground, the folding gates open onto a scene that looks like it could be in a modern art museum. A sculpture made of old soft drink cans and other scrap metal welcomes visitors as they step out of the elevator. The artwork is meant to symbolize society's unresolved waste disposal problem. Trash People is the name of the work, a creation by the Cologne-based conceptual artist H.A. Schultz. Of the army of similar scrap metal sculptures he installed a few years ago in the site, which is earmarked as a possible permanent repository for radioactive waste, one remains today as a warning, next to an information panel describing Schultz's happening called Quiet Days at Gorleben. The force behind the subversive artworks was Green Party politician Jürgen Trittin, who was the German environment minister under former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder's coalition government of the center-left Social Democrats and Green Party. But the art is not the only legacy of the SPD Green Party era. What is more significant is the research moratorium that the former administration imposed on Gorleben in 2000, putting a stop to research into whether the salt dome was suitable for use as a storage site for nuclear waste. The drilling machines have been idle since then, and life only returns to the site, which is located in the Wendland region of the northern state of Lower Saxony, when groups of visitors arrive. They are driven through the seemingly endless tunnels in a Mercedes SUV. Anyone who is so inclined can lick the grayish-white salt from the walls. It is apparently of the highest quality. But now the new government plans to allow research activities to resume as soon as possible, and instead of artists and salt dome tourists, the site could soon be buzzing with geologists and nuclear physicists once again. Germany's new coalition government of the center-right Christian Democrats and the business-friendly Free Democrats want to continue with research into the suitability of Gorleben as a national permanent repository for radioactive waste. But that isn't likely to happen anytime soon, because the SPD, the Greens, and the Left Party will not hand over the salt dome to the Conservatives without a fight. This month they plan to petition for the establishment of an investigative committee to look at the Gorleben project. The issue of radioactive waste is set to become a major bone of contention between the government and the opposition. As the petition states, the purpose of the committee will be to uncover errors and omissions made over a period of 3 decades as completely as possible, as well as to investigate undue exertion of political influence and conflicts of interest within the federal government due to its close ties to the industry. Same crap that goes on here goes on in other countries as well. Was political manipulation involved in the selection of Gorleben as a site? The suspicions are very clear, says Sylvia Uhl, the Green Party's nuclear policy spokeswoman, who initiated the investigation committee together with other members of her party. Documents and studies from 3 decades will now be carefully scrutinized, as will the roles of a number of chancellors, state governors, and cabinet ministers. The Commission will be asking a number of important questions. For instance, why did planners decide on Gorleben early on? Why weren't alternatives seriously considered, and why aren't they being considered today? And what happens if the salt dome turns out to be unsuitable? The fact-finding commission will do more than revisit the past. It also has the potential to disqualify Gorleben as a potential storage site once and for all, to take the search for permanent repositories back to the drawing board, and put the brakes on the current administration's nuclear policy. The Commission will be examining a decades-long history of trickery and deception, confronting the lie that the German nuclear industry is based on, namely the constant postponement and suppression of its waste problem. Previously unknown documents and interviews with contemporary witnesses already reveal that instead of geology and nuclear physics, partisan politics and power struggles shaped the search for permanent repositories from the start, which is why a feasible solution hasn't been found to this day. But the industry's spent fuel rods will have to be disposed of somewhere. Germany's mountain of radioactive waste, which is growing from one year to the next, cannot be kept in ordinary warehouses forever. The Germany-based independent expert and research organization GRS, which analyzes reactor safety, estimates that German atomic power plants consume about 400 tons of nuclear fuel per year, producing highly toxic waste that remains radioactive for thousands of years. If Germany's nuclear phase-out continues as planned, at least 17,000 tons of spent fuel rods will have to be disposed of, not to mention the irradiated tubes, filters, and parts of the reactor vessels of decommissioned nuclear power plants. In one of the 2 above-ground buildings at Gorleben, there is currently 3,500 steel, cast iron, and concrete containers of mildly and moderately contaminated waste, such as cleaning rags, radioactive sludge, and moderately radioactive scrap metal, which are scheduled to be buried in the Conrad repository in Lower Saxony soon. The second storage building contains 91 Castor, TS-28V, and TN-85 metal containers of used fuel elements and reprocessing waste. This is highly radioactive waste that officials hope will eventually be permanently stored underground somewhere. In the coming years, another 43 containers of highly radioactive waste from 2 reprocessing plants, La Hague in France and Sellafield in Great Britain, will be brought to the Gorleben depot on ships, trucks, and trains. Because the transport of Castor containers had repeatedly been met with heated protests, the former SPD Green Party government in 2002 ordered the nuclear industry to build interim storage sites for used fuel elements next to nuclear power plants to reduce the need for shipments. As a result of this policy, a portion of Germany's radioactive waste is still being kept in 12 of these interim storage buildings, distributed throughout the country, pending the discovery and development of a permanent repository. But where should the radioactive waste go? Two former environment ministers are at the center of this dispute, Angela Merkel and Sigmar Gabriel. Both know exactly how polarizing the subject of nuclear energy is. Now Merkel is the chancellor and Gabriel is the chairman of the SPD, and radioactive waste stands a good chance of becoming the focus of their rivalry. Once again, politics, and not the welfare of future generations, is at the center of the nuclear waste issue. To protect those generations, a site must be found where radioactive waste can be allowed to slowly decay over hundreds of thousands of years, far away from any living creatures. This permanent repository will still have to be impervious in the year 8010, not to mention the year 308,010. Otherwise, its contents could poison the living beings of the future if they discovered the contaminated containers, or the waste could gradually seep out and destroy the local environment. The question, then, is why exactly Gorleben was chosen as the most suitable location to fulfill this role. The first politicians who clashed over the long-term storage issue in the late 70s were then Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and Ernst Albrecht, the governor of Lower Saxony at the time. Neither of the two men was particularly well versed in geology or nuclear physics. At the time after the first oil crisis, West Germany was developing ambitious plans for nuclear energy. Politicians hoped that by building 50 nuclear power plants, the country could create a source of cheap and inexhaustible electricity. To fulfill this vision, a large permanent repository for radioactive waste was needed. It was also clear what this entailed: a good salt dome, a kind of geological structure deep beneath the Earth's surface, which is believed to be particularly stable and impervious to water. This was bad news for Lower Saxony, which is home to hundreds of salt domes. The federal government's demand to the state's geological research agency was simple: just pick one. In what resembled a clandestine commando operation, drilling teams arrived in the eastern region near the village of Borger in early 1976, claiming to be searching for oil. But village residents soon figured out what was going on and quickly formed action groups and drafted resolutions. Local dairy farmers staged protests, fearing that their milk might become tainted by waste from a radioactive storage site and would then be unmarketable. 8 potential sites were identified, 3 of them in Lower Saxony. Gorleben was not one of the sites, at least from the perspective of geologists, who believed the sites at Borger, Alden, and Fassberg were more suitable, but geologists are not politicians. The governor, Ernst Albrecht, soon decided that he had had enough of the ensuing unrest in his state. Elections were coming up, and Albrecht, who reasoned that the sites of protest at various salt domes in his state would have been his political undoing, wrote a furious letter to Chancellor Schmidt in Bonn. The drilling operations, he wrote, required significant police protection involving large numbers of personnel. Unfortunately, he continued, this was something he could not guarantee at adequate levels at the present time. The Germans really take their protesting seriously. Albrecht decided to take a proactive approach to solving the problem and instructed his state geological research agency to search for a suitable site. That was how the name of Gorleben came up. The village was located in a thinly populated area near the border with East Germany. Given the underdeveloped local economy, he reasoned that the locals would surely welcome a major project. In other words, Gorleben was the perfect spot for a long-term radioactive waste storage site from a politician's standpoint. But politicians are not geologists. In their assessment, the geologists pointed out that Gorleben was located in a level 1 earthquake zone, the only one of the potential sites in such a zone. The experts also noted with some concern that the Gorleben salt dome was beneath the Elbe River. Finally, they wrote that it was highly likely that there is a natural gas deposit located at a depth of about 3,500 meters below the salt dome, and that any attempts to recover the gas could lead to large-scale subsidence of the soil, which is exactly what we are seeing happen at the Bayou Corne sinkhole in Louisiana. They added that when West Germany drilled for gas across the border, there were explosions that destroyed a drilling rig. Earthquakes, natural gas, and explosions? These aren't exactly the words one likes to hear when searching for a permanent repository site designed to last for several 100,000 years. Chancellor Schmidt argued that the Gorleben site was also unsuitable for international political reasons. His government feared that East Germany could even take control of the Gorleben permanent repository in a surprise attack. Bonn ruled that Albrecht's choice could not be considered. In politics, there are abstract risks and very real dangers. The fear of earthquakes or an invasion by the East German National People's Army is relatively abstract, but protests at several salt dome sites, on the other hand, represented a very real danger. Albrecht sensed that the fight over a radioactive waste storage site would be much more contentious than the controversy over any nuclear power plant. He clearly outlined the risks in his draft bill, the nature and size of the potential deployment area, the unpredictable duration of the expected demonstrations, and the predictable, extremely determined, methodical, and violent actions of nationally coordinated radical groups will require a police operation on an unprecedented scale. In other words, the less densely populated an area was, the less likely it was that protests would be significant, and the easier it would be to control those protests. Based on these arguments, Gorleben was chosen in February of 1977. The next few years would bring conflict and benefits to the region. The local hospital argued it needed a new annex, while the fire department said it required 10 new fire trucks due to the elevated risk of forest fires. The federal government was happy to pay up, with officials reasoning that a certain generosity could only promote local acceptance of the project. Lower Saxony, Gorleben, and the neighboring villages received a total of about 500 million German marks, or $256 million, some of it contributed by the nuclear industry. Thus, Gorleben became a pawn in the hands of politicians and business leaders, a fact that both characterizes and hampers the search for a permanent repository to this day. Since then, generations of politicians, scientists, and civil servants have been embroiled in the debate. For some people, it became a subject they could never forget. One of them is Helmut Rothmeyer, a professor and a physicist. There is probably no one in Germany who has devoted so much of his energy to studying the geology of the Wendland region. Rothmeyer, 71, is now retired and lives at the end of a dead-end street, less than 2 kilometers from his former office in the northern German city of Braunschweig. He has written a number of books on the subject, and he has helpfully laid them out on his dining room table next to stacks of old documents. Rothmeyer, a tall, gaunt man, walks to the table with a stoop and trembles slightly as he flips through the documents, his life's work. The heading on one page reads Schedule for 1977, while another reads Opening in 1990, Operations begin in 1994. The documents reflect the belief held at the time that everything would happen quickly and smoothly. Rothmeyer, a department head at the Braunschweig-based National Mineralology Institute of Germany, was responsible for the Gorleben file. But no matter what the professor and his experts concluded in their analysis, they were constantly confronted with political problems. It began with Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, whose chancellery used the initial research results to sound the alarm in 1981. According to a Bonn memo, there was reason to believe that the salt dome is not ideal from a geological standpoint. The experts took the hint, but Schmidt's SPD-FDP coalition government, anxious not to jeopardize the project's support within the Lower Saxony state government, did not take the necessary action. 2 years later, in the spring of 1983, Rothmeyer and the PTB Institute submitted another interim report. By this time, geologists had examined layers of rock above the salt dome and concluded that it was possible that they were not impermeable. In light of the unknown surrounding Gorleben, I want to suggest in the report that investigations be conducted at other sites as a precautionary measure, Rothmeier recalls today. But that was unacceptable. Once again there was trouble with Bonn, this time because the experts' proposal was not what the new conservative administration of then-Chancellor Helmut Kohl wanted to hear. The new Chancellor's staff sent Rothmeier a telex in which they wrote, "The question about other sites should be removed from the document." Determined to not allow a search for alternative storage sites to trigger nationwide unrest at any cost, they decided to focus their efforts on the struggle over Gorleben. It was a battle they waged using every tool in the state's arsenal against the anti-nuclear activists who were protesting there, including the use of water cannons and police cordons. It was only Kohl's successor, Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, a social democrat, who put an end to the controversy when his administration abandoned the investigation in Gorleben in 2000 as part of a deal reached between the Green Party coalition of government and energy companies to phase out nuclear power. The government argued that it was essential to clarify what was going to happen with the country's radioactive waste and that alternative sites should also be considered. Rothmeier's opinion was no longer in demand. In the past, we Germans were highly sought after at international conferences because Gorleben put us at the forefront of the global radioactive waste storage issue, he says. According to Rothmeier, no country was as far along in its research on long-term radioactive storage as Germany was. But the government's decision to suspend the research changed everything. The Swiss and the Finns are now setting the tone, and experts at international conferences have little to say to Rothmeier these days. In Germany's last national election campaign, nuclear energy was one of the few polarizing issues. Then Environment Minister Sigmar Gabriel had placed the storage site issue on the agenda, accusing the members of the former Kohl administration of manipulating and insinuating that Chancellor Merkel may have also played a role. "I think Miss Merkel has good reasons to distance herself from her predecessor," Gabriel said, to applause from his supporters. He was elected chairman of the SPD soon afterwards. As Environment Minister, Gabriel drastically tightened the requirements for the planned German radioactive waste storage site. The new rules require, for example, that no more than very small amounts of hazardous materials can be released from the permanent repository for more than 1 million years, a substantial increase over the previous figure of 10,000 years. According to another of the new requirements, the recovery of waste from the permanent repository must be possible in an emergency and over the long term. The underground technology must remain accessible and modifiable for future generations. In contrast, the intent of the previous set of standards was to bury the radioactive waste in the salt dome in such a way that it would be irretrievably and ultimately inaccessible. Given these requirements, a search for alternative sites is in fact inevitable. And politically speaking, at least from the standpoint of the SPD, it's highly desirable because such a search can only harm the Christian Democrats. If scientists began looking for alternative storage sites in other parts of Germany today, it would trigger as much unrest as the supposed oil exploration teams did in Lower Saxony in the 1970s. Not in my backyard. Gabriel knows from experience how burdensome the waste issue can become. The controversies over the annual castor transports were already a thorn in his side when he was governor of Lower Saxony. Those who think nuclear energy is so wonderful should take on its waste, he once told a group of CDU state governors. Gabriel cleverly put forward regions that were earthquake-proof and where clay deposits offered impermeability to water, regions that, as he argued, might be more suitable than the salt dome in Lower Saxony. It just so happened that these more desirable geological formations were particularly prevalent in the southern states of Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, states which were governed by the CDU and its Bavarian sister party, the CSU. Not surprisingly, many conservatives were horrified when under the CDU Grand coalition government, which was in power from 2005 to 2009, the Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources published a study on possible permanent repository sites in Germany. In Baden-Württemberg alone, the institute identified 2 regions as being worth investigating. One of those regions is Donautal near Ulm in the southwestern state of Baden-Württemberg. Although studies have only identified the region's clay deposits as potentially suitable for a permanent repository site, local resistance soon developed, with activists quickly finding counter-arguments against the BGR's analysis. Baden-Württemberg is one of the most seismically active regions in Germany, says one of the movement's leaders. The last quakes were quite noticeable. Federal Research Minister Annette Chauvin, whose electoral district could possibly be the location of a future repository, has also weighed in. A suitable site has already been found, she said. So far, no one's been able to plausibly demonstrate that the Gorleben salt dome is not suitable. Another potential permanent repository site near the Swiss border would be adjacent to the election district of the Christian Democrats' floor leader, Volker Kador. He too is keen to sing Gorleben's praises. A suitable permanent repository site has been found and the project should finally be realized. He says, the State Environment Ministry in Stuttgart, for its part, was quick to issue a statement pointing out that the clay formation in the hold of Baden-Württemberg is unsuitable. And then there is Bavaria, which could also offer alternatives, such as sites in the Felftenberg mountain range or in the Bavarian forest, with its solid granitic layers. There is not a single site in Bavaria that is as well suited as Gorleben, claims Markus Soder, the state's environment minister. That has been the conclusion of every study. 9 of Germany's 17 nuclear power plants currently in operation are located in Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, and the governors in Munich and Stuttgart have traditionally supported nuclear power. Why then are these 2 states refusing to take responsibility for the waste produced there? It's not a question of federalism, but of geology, says Kauder, who isn't exactly known as a geological expert. The Chancellery in Berlin has also bowed to pressure from Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, despite its initial willingness to look into other possible repository sites. Merkel's then Chief of Staff, Thomas de Maizière, had initially indicated that the Chancellor also supported a search for alternative sites, said Gabriel, recalling his tenure in the Grand Coalition, but then he adds the southern state governors balked. Their position on radioactive waste reflects the view held by most Germans. According to a 2002 survey by the Institute of Technology, Assessment and System Analysis, 73% of Germans felt that a permanent repository for radioactive waste was urgently needed, but only 19% said they would tolerate one in their state. These attitudes are reflected in the fierce reactions of those most affected by the issue, the residents of the Wendland region around Gorleben. After a number of relatively quiet years, protests have become more strident since the last election. At about 10 p.m. on a Saturday evening last fall, for example, 5 tractors honking their horns suddenly emerged from a forest and proceeded towards the gate marking the beginning of a restricted area surrounding the Gorleben site. The first of the tractors came to a stop only a few centimeters in front of a police officer. Suddenly, 100 activists were facing off against a handful of nervous police officers, while the Italian partisan song Bella Ciao blared from speakers on one of the tractors. The protesters were carrying signs that read "Block, Sabotage, Destroy." It was a scene reminiscent of the heated anti-nuclear protests of the 1980s and 1990s. In the dark, masked figures stealthily walked up to the security fence, cut the mesh wire, and stormed the site. Within a few minutes, bonfires were burning on the grounds, casting a blood-red glow on the drilling tower, which contains an elevator that is supposed to eventually transport radioactive waste into the depths of the storage site. The activists calmly took control of the premises, spraying the walls with graffiti. Police reinforcements did not arrive for another hour, when they pursued the protesters and arrested some of them. It appears that the days of sit-ins and water cannons are about to return. Environment Minister has until March to submit a bill on the planned repository to the Cabinet, a deadline that will mark the end of a 10-year research moratorium. There is no doubt that the government will reopen the salt dome and allow the research activities to continue. We have to concentrate on Gorleben now, says Rotjen. But even without the investigation, the nuclear industry is not in a position to simply pick up its work at the Gorleben salt dome where it left off. First, it will have to hire and train new employees, revise its plans, and dust off its drilling machinery. According to a plan for the resumption of the Gorleben project, and even only then if the federal government approves the annual budget of between 150 million to 200 million Deutschmarks, that's $290 million. In other words, as the plan states, the entire endeavor will be extremely costly and time-consuming. An obligation to future generations. Many years ago, an auto industry wanted to buy Andrea Graf's forest and install a waste storage site on the land. It was very attractive, 27 million German marks for 670 acres of sandy wooded property, 10 times as much as the forested land was worth, but he decided not to sell. He is an absent-minded country gentleman with a penchant for hats and cigars. I tend to be conservative, he says. He was a member of the CDU when the debate took over from nuclear power for the first time. I hope you enjoyed that article, and I hope you could see the similarities of what other people have experienced in other parts of the world about similar issues. I'm going to drop the link into chat for the 2-year anniversary video that I put together. I hope to make more. Everyone have a wonderful weekend, and we'll be back next Tuesday. Have fun on your trip, Jules. Thanks, Christina.